Imagine waking up in complete darkness, your body immobilized, unable to scream for help. Your eyes begin to adjust to the dim light, and you notice mirrors all around you, positioned so that you are forced to witness everything that is about to happen. Then a calm, almost polite voice begins to explain in surgical detail what will come in the next few hours. There is no negotiation, there is no hope of rescue, only the terrifying certainty that someone has planned every second of your suffering, like someone preparing an elaborate meal. This is not a horror movie script. This really happened in the New Mexico desert, inside a trailer that David Parker Ray affectionately called Toy Box. He kept his victims alive for 14 hours, not to extract confessions, not out of revenge or anger, simply because he could. Because in that meticulously prepared space, with surgical instruments hanging on the walls and chains adjusted to the perfect height, he was no longer the invisible man that no one noticed in the city. He was a temporary god deciding on life, death, and everything in between. The audio tape the victims listened to upon waking wasn't improvised. It was a rehearsed script, a macabre performance that revealed something far more disturbing than explosive violence. Cold planning, calculated methodology, structured pleasure. This raises the question no one wants to ask aloud, but that everyone needs to understand. What exactly breaks within a human mind to transform the suffering of another living being into personal entertainment? What happens in the neural circuits of someone who not only commits violence, but orchestrates it as a performance? Because here's the uncomfortable truth this video will reveal. Understanding the psychology of extreme sadism isn't morbid curiosity. It isn't a sick fascination with horror. It's pure self-defense. It's the difference between recognizing danger signs before getting into the wrong car, accepting the wrong invitation, trusting the wrong person. It's knowing how to identify the kind of mind that should never, under any circumstances, have access to your life. And what you're about to discover will completely change how you see human behavior. Because these predators don't appear out of nowhere in a sudden fit of madness. Because these predators don't appear out of nowhere in a sudden fit of madness. They build their fantasies over years, test limits, observe reactions, and choose victims with the precision of a hunter studying prey behavior. And that's exactly why you need to be here now, absorbing every word of this video. If what you're hearing is already making your mind connect dots you never noticed before, leave a comment now telling me what warning sign you've ignored in your life without realizing the real danger. Like this video because this type of content, real psychological education about criminal minds, without romanticization, without spectacle, needs to reach more people who still think this would never happen to me. And if you want to continue learning to read human behavior like an FBI profiler, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because the next videos will dissect other types of predators that operate disguised in your daily life. Now back to what really matters, the psychological architecture behind this extreme form of sadism. Because before David Parker Ray built that trailer, before he recorded that audio tape with instructions for his victims, something fundamental had already broken within his mental structure. And this breakdown begins in a way that most people would never imagine. Let's get straight to the most fundamental point. When you see someone trip in the street, your body automatically reacts with a small spasm of discomfort, right? When you watch someone get hurt, even in a video, you feel that tightness in your stomach. This is not a coincidence. It's your brain doing exactly what it should be doing. Mirror neurons activating. The anterior cingulate cortex processing the other person's pain as if it were your own. It's empathy operating on autopilot, one of the characteristics that define us as functional human beings. But here's what happens in the mind of a sadist. This neurological circuit not only fails, it completely reverses. Functional neuroimaging studies conducted with individuals diagnosed with psychopathic traits reveal something disturbing. When these people are exposed to images of human suffering, the areas of the brain associated with the reward system begin to light up. We're not talking about indifference, about simply feeling nothing. We're talking about active pleasure, dopamine being released, reward circuits being activated as if they were seeing something pleasant. They don't ignore suffering. They feed on it as emotional fuel. Dennis Rader, the infamous BTK killer who terrorized Wichita, Kansas for decades, wrote in his private diaries a sentence that perfectly summarizes this distorted dynamic. When I saw the fear in their eyes, it was like an electric current passed through me. I felt powerful, complete. Read that again. He wasn't describing mental confusion. He wasn't reporting a dissociative trance or an episode of loss of control. He was describing profound satisfaction, a sense of personal accomplishment derived directly from the terror he caused. And there's an even more frightening detail. In this equation, most of these individuals report that the first signs of this pattern appeared very early, usually in childhood or early adolescence. Pleasure in hurting small animals, fascination with putting others in dangerous or embarrassing situations, emotional excitement in causing fear in weaker peers. These aren't childish errors of judgment or normal developmental phases. They're rehearsals, early experiments with power and control. The brain is literally learning to associate the suffering of others with internal reward. It's not an explosive moment of madness that appears out of nowhere at age 30. It's a psychological structure being built brick by brick, year after year, until it finally consolidates into something far more dangerous. And this gradual construction has a very specific internal logic that explains why these crimes are never really about anger or revenge. And this gradual buildup has a very specific internal logic that explains why these crimes are never really about anger or revenge. Because here's the truth that many people don't understand. Prolonged torture has nothing to do with killing someone quickly. If the goal were simply to take a life, there are infinitely faster and more efficient methods. But efficiency isn't the point. The point is management. Total control over every aspect of another person's experience. Deciding when they breathe normally and when they struggle for air. Determining the exact moment when the pain becomes unbearable but still keeping them conscious. Choosing when to allow them to faint and when to wake them up again. It's the transformation of a human being into a living experiment of absolute domination. The sadist becomes, for a few hours or days, a temporary god with the power of life and death over another individual. And this feeling is so intense, so addictive, that many of them create systems to preserve and relive that moment. David Parker Ray not only committed the crimes, he meticulously recorded them on video. Not for distribution, not for financial gain. He wanted to be able to sit alone in his house and re-watch those recordings, reliving the feeling of absolute power as many times as he wished. It was like creating a personal archive of moments when he was more than just an ordinary man ignored by society. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng took this to an even more elaborate level when they built a specially designed bunker on Lake's property in California. They called the women they kept there perfect slaves. And that choice of words reveals everything. It wasn't simply about murder. It was about completely reshaping the identity of another human being through systematic terror, breaking down the existing personality, rebuilding something submissive and obedient, exerting control over every thought and action. This is what we call structured sadism. There is no improvisation. There is no uncontrolled emotional outburst. There is meticulous planning. Scenarios prepared in advance, established protocols, scripts followed. It's eerily similar to the work of a film director orchestrating every scene of a movie, except the actors are real people who can't leave the set, and the script involves genuine suffering. The psychology behind it is crystal clear when you analyze the life context of these individuals. In most cases, they are people who spend their daily lives feeling completely powerless, insignificant, invisible to others. Nobody notices them. Nobody respects them. Nobody fears them. But inside that basement, that isolated trailer in the desert, that locked room with a key only they possess, the dynamic is completely reversed. There they are no longer the mediocre employee, the forgettable neighbor, the man who goes unnoticed in the crowd. In that controlled space, they are supreme authorities, figures of absolute power, entities that decide on life and death. And this temporary transformation of status creates a psychological dependence that drives them to repeat the behavior indefinitely, refining their techniques with each iteration, always seeking that increasingly intense dose of control. But there's something even more disturbing about this pattern of behavior that most people never realize until it's too late. But there's something even more disturbing about this pattern of behavior that most people never realize until it's too late. Because here's the dangerous illusion we need to destroy now. Sadists don't wake up one random Tuesday and decide to build a torture chamber from scratch. They don't go from 0 to 100 overnight. There's a gradual process, a silent escalation that happens right under your nose, and most victims only realize it when they're already deeply entangled. They test you first, always. It starts with seemingly insignificant things that you even question whether you should bother with. A hurtful comment disguised as a joke. When you react, they say you're too sensitive, that you can't take humor. These are tests of psychological limits. Will this person accept disrespect? Will they confront or swallow it silently? Small violations of privacy, snooping through your things, reading your messages, showing up unannounced. Gifts that come with implicit conditions. Kindnesses that carry emotional debt, making you feel you need to reciprocate in some way. Each interaction is a behavioral experiment to gauge how far they can go without resistance. Robert Berdella is a perfect example of this calculated methodology. He was known in Kansas City as a respectable, polite, and kind antique dealer. Neighbors described him as helpful. He would invite young men to his home with genuine promises of help, a place to stay, a hot meal, career guidance. At first, that was exactly it. Real hospitality, pleasant conversations, a welcoming environment. Then came the drink offered with something mixed in. When the victim awoke hours later, the social mask had completely fallen, revealing the true intention that was there all along, just waiting for the right moment. This process has a technical name in forensic psychology: grooming. And here's what many people don't know. Grooming isn't exclusive to cases of child abuse. Adult predators who prey on other adults also meticulously prepare their victims. They test emotional reactions. They observe behavioral patterns. They identify who is vulnerable, who is socially isolated, who wouldn't be immediately sought out if they disappeared for a few days. They are patient strategists analyzing the playing field before making any definitive move. And here's the absolutely vital part for your personal safety that you need to remember now. These predators preferentially choose people who have already learned through past life experiences to normalize discomfort. Individuals who have been conditioned to ignore their own instincts, to question their own perceptions, to accept inadequate treatment because it's not that serious or because I might be exaggerating. If you grew up in an environment where your emotions were constantly invalidated, where you learned not to trust your own judgment, where complaining about mistreatment was seen as weakness or unnecessary drama, you have statistically become a more attractive target for this type of predator. And this specific vulnerability is exploited with surgical precision throughout the entire approach process, because the more you normalize the first warning signs, because the more you normalize the early warning signs, the easier it becomes for them to progress to more dangerous stages without encountering resistance. But now we need to enter the darker territory of this analysis. What exactly goes through a sadist's mind during the act itself? What happens neurologically in those moments of active torture? Because understanding this internal dynamic is crucial to understanding why these crimes are repeated and escalate over time. Forensic interviews with captured murderers, conducted by criminal psychologists over decades, reveal an absolutely disturbing pattern. Most of these individuals describe the experience not as chaotic or frantic, but rather as profoundly meditative. Ian Brady, of the infamous Moors murders case that shocked England in the 1960s, said in a psychiatric interview that during the execution of the crimes he experienced absolute clarity, as if the world finally made sense, as if all the pieces fit together perfectly. Read that again, and let the gravity of that statement sink in. He wasn't describing confusion, panic, or dissociation. I was describing total lucidity, complete focus, a mental state of flow where everything seemed to be in its right place. And here's the psychological reason behind it. There's no remorse operating in real time during these acts, because at that specific moment, they are experiencing possibly the most intense feeling of control and power that one human being can exert over another. It's a massive neurological discharge of dopamine, serotonin, and other neurotransmitters associated with gratification and reward. It's literally addictive in the chemical sense of the word. For many of these individuals, it's the only moment in their entire lives when they feel genuinely alive, present, meaningful. Everything outside that context is gray, empty, purposeless. But there's another fundamental component in this equation that explains the inevitable progression of these crimes: progressive desensitization. The first time someone commits an extreme act of violence, even individuals with severely compromised empathy may experience some residual discomfort, some initial hesitation, some psychological noise. But the human brain is an incredibly efficient adaptation machine. Each repetition of the behavior erases another fragment of residual humanity. Neural circuits reorganize themselves. What once caused shock now becomes routine procedure. What once generated that intense discharge of power now produces only a moderate response. And here's where things get truly dangerous. Just as any chemical addiction requires progressively larger doses to achieve the same effect, the sadist needs to escalate the intensity, duration, and cruelty of their acts to feel that same level of power they experienced the first few times. That's why you see a clear progression in most studied cases. They begin with fantasies, then voyeurism, then minor acts of control, eventually physical violence, and finally prolonged torture and murder. Each stage neurologically prepares the ground for the next. They literally need to increase the dose to maintain the effect, and this growing need transforms them into something increasingly monstrous over time. But even understanding all this internal mechanics, there's still a question that confuses many people when these cases come to light. But even understanding all this inner workings, there's still a question that confuses many people when these cases come to light. People look at the extreme cruelty, the calculated coldness, the complete absence of humanity, and immediately conclude, this person must be completely insane, right? It has to be insanity. It has to be a mind totally disconnected from reality. But here's the inconvenient truth that the legal system and forensic psychology repeatedly confirm. The vast majority of sadistic torturers are not legally insane. They do not meet the clinical criteria for insanity. They know perfectly well, with crystal clarity, what they are doing. They meticulously plan every detail. They carefully conceal evidence. They lie convincingly to the police during interrogations. They maintain two completely separate lives for years, sometimes decades, without being discovered. This requires functional cognition, strategic thinking, and awareness of consequences. Insanity, in the legal psychiatric sense, means losing fundamental contact with reality, having hallucinations that control your actions, genuinely believing you are someone else, not being able to distinguish fantasy from reality. But David Parker Ray woke up every day, went to a regular job, interacted normally with colleagues, paid his bills on time, had casual conversations with neighbors about the weather and sports, and then, when the opportunity arose, he went to his trailer and transformed into something else. This is not uncontrollable mental illness. This is deliberate choice. Forensic psychology makes an absolutely crucial distinction here that everyone needs to understand: capacity versus inclination. Just because someone has an intense inclination, a deep desire to do something horrible, doesn't mean that person has lost the capacity to control that impulse. And the proof of this lies in the very behavioral patterns of these criminals. They demonstrate exceptional control when there is a real risk of being caught. Do you notice that they rarely, almost never, attack police officers? Rarely commit acts of extreme violence in crowded public places? They carefully choose vulnerable targets, isolated, marginalized people who wouldn't be immediately sought out. They select safe, private locations where they have complete control of the environment. If it were truly an uncontrollable compulsion, a madness that removes all capacity for judgment, there wouldn't be this level of strategic calculation, this constant assessment of risk versus reward. The technical term in psychiatric literature is sexual sadism, when there is a direct erotic component linked to the act of inflicting pain, or sadistic personality disorder, when the motivation is purely about exercising power and control without sexual gratification. But here's what you really need to know. Diagnosis is not an excuse. Having a psychiatric label doesn't remove moral or legal responsibility. These people perfectly understand the concepts of right and wrong. They simply don't care. The moral distinction exists in their minds. They just completely ignore it because their own desires are more important than the suffering of other human beings. And this conscious choice to ignore basic ethics has direct implications for how these people behave when they are finally caught. And this conscious choice to ignore basic ethics has direct implications for how these people behave when they are finally caught. But before we get there, let's focus on what really matters. To you right now, how to identify a potential sadist before you become a victim. Because all this theoretical knowledge about neurology and criminal psychology is worthless if you can't apply it to your real life to recognize danger when it appears disguised as a normal person. First warning sign: visible pleasure in the discomfort of others. Pay attention to how someone reacts when another person gets hurt. even if it's something small like tripping or spilling hot coffee. Does the person laugh disproportionately, make sarcastic comments instead of offering help, create pranks that are actually humiliations disguised as humor? Test your emotional limits just to see how you react under pressure? This isn't a sharp sense of humor. It's a lack of a properly functioning empathic circuit. Second sign, lack of selective empathy. This is especially revealing because it shows they can feign empathy when it's convenient. They can be absolutely charming, attentive, and kind to people they consider useful, bosses, clients, anyone who might benefit them. But observe how that same person treats a waiter who got the order wrong, a stray animal, a child crying in public, someone in a vulnerable situation. If the mask falls and coldness, irritation, or even verbal cruelty appears towards those they consider inferior or irrelevant, you've just seen their true personality. Third sign, and this one is absolutely non-negotiable, a history of cruelty to animals. This isn't a childhood phase that's past. It's not childish scientific curiosity. It's a rehearsal for future behavior with human victims. Criminology research consistently shows that an alarming percentage of sadistic killers began by torturing animals during adolescence. If someone casually mentions that they used to hurt animals when they were young, or if you notice that this person takes pleasure in causing suffering to animals now, you're facing a giant red flag. Fourth sign, obsession with control over their life. They want to know where you are all the time, not out of genuine concern but out of a need for monitoring. They progressively isolate you from friends and family through subtle negative comments about these people. They punish any demonstration of autonomy or independence with punitive silence, passive aggression, or emotional outbursts. They make you feel you need to ask permission for basic decisions in your own life. Fifth sign, complete emotional disconnection after conflicts. When confronted about problematic behavior, they offer no genuine apologies. They minimize the impact of their own actions. They twist the situation to make you feel guilty for bringing up the subject. They use phrases like, "You're too sensitive," "You're exaggerating," "It was just a joke," "You're crazy." This is classic psychological manipulation designed to make you question your own perception of reality. And here's the most important advice you'll hear today. If you know someone who combines 3 or more of these behavioral signs, walk away immediately. Don't try to save this person. Don't try to fix them through love, patience, or understanding. It's not your responsibility, it's not your mission, and you don't have the professional tools necessary to deal with this level of psychological dysfunction. Your only responsibility is to protect your own safety, and that means creating physical and emotional distance as quickly as possible. But understanding these signs also leads us to another crucial question that explains why these patterns rarely change. But understanding these signs also leads us to another crucial question that explains why these patterns rarely change. Many people ask, with genuine confusion, why don't they stop after the first crime? Why don't they feel enough remorse to never do it again? Why do some continue for years, even decades, repeating the same cycle of violence? The answer is uncomfortably simple, because it worked. The human brain, at its most fundamental level, is a reward-learning machine. When you perform an action and that action generates intense pleasure, deep gratification, a feeling of absolute power, all without immediate negative consequences, your brain registers this pattern and encodes a very clear message. Do it again. It's basic neuroscience, the same mechanism that makes us repeat any pleasurable behavior. Jerry Brudos, known as the high heel killer who operated in Oregon in the late 60s, meticulously kept the shoes of his victims. They weren't death trophies in the traditional sense. They weren't morbid reminders of lives he took. They were psychological portals. Each shoe was a neural trigger that allowed him to mentally relive that moment of absolute power, that massive dopamine rush, that feeling of total control. He could look at those objects years later and still feel echoes of that original gratification. Beyond this neurological dimension, there is also the brutally practical factor. They improve with practice. Like any complex skill, committing crimes without getting caught requires planning, execution, and risk management. Initial crimes often contain errors, leaving forensic evidence, choosing unsuitable locations, underestimating how much time they need, not considering all the variables. But each repetition works as training. They learn from their own mistakes. They refine their techniques. They become progressively more careful, more efficient, and safer in their operations. That's why some of these criminals manage to operate for decades without being captured. They literally perfect the method over time, eliminating vulnerabilities, optimizing procedures. And then there's perhaps the most sinister component of this whole dynamic. Fantasy invariably loses to reality. Sadists spend years, sometimes their entire lives, constructing elaborate fantasies in their minds. They imagine perfect scenarios where everything happens exactly as planned, where the victim reacts precisely as desired, where every detail aligns with their mental vision. But when they finally cross that line and transform fantasy into real action, reality never quite reaches that imagined perfection. There's always some element that deviates from the mental script. The victim doesn't show the right kind of fear. Some logistical aspect doesn't work as expected. The emotional experience isn't as intense as anticipated. So what happens? They try again, adjusting variables, changing approaches, obsessively seeking that perfect execution of their distorted fantasy that exists only in their heads. It's an endless search because the imagined perfection can never be completely replicated in the messy reality of the physical world. And this endless quest for an ideal version that doesn't exist keeps the cycle spinning indefinitely, crime after crime, victim after victim, until something external finally interrupts them, which inevitably brings us to the question of what happens when that external interruption finally occurs. When they are captured, when the handcuffs close, when legal reality catches up with them. Sadists generally exhibit one of two very distinct behavioral patterns, and understanding these final masks is crucial to avoid being deceived by the public performance that takes place during trials. The first type is what we might call the proud one. These people finally have the audience they always wanted. They want to tell everything. They detail each crime with disturbing precision, as if they were describing works of art deserving of recognition. They actively seek to control the public narrative, to ensure that their version is heard, that the magnitude of what they did is understood. Some even collaborate with the police to locate bodies or additional evidence. But don't confuse this with remorse or regret. They do this to demonstrate intellectual superiority, to prove they are smarter than the investigators, to maintain some form of power even while handcuffed. Dennis Rader, the BTK, sent detailed letters to newspapers describing his crimes because he literally couldn't stop bragging. The desire for recognition was so strong that it eventually led to his capture. He couldn't resist the temptation to publicly discuss his own exploits. The second type is the manipulator, and these are perhaps even more dangerous in a sense, because they deceive even experienced professionals. They study basic psychology while awaiting trial. They feign deep remorse. They cry in court with tears that seem genuine. They construct elaborate narratives blaming childhood abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, even voices in their heads that never existed. They learn exactly what kind of story generates sympathy, what kind of vulnerability makes juries hesitate, what words to use to appear reformable, and thus potentially reduce their sentences. Ted Bundy was an absolute master of this performance. He strategically alternated between extremely detailed confessions that satisfied investigators and sophisticated emotional manipulation that generated media attention and public sympathy, all depending on what benefited him most at the moment. But here's the truth that unites these two seemingly opposite types. Neither of them possesses genuine remorse. Zero. They deeply regret being caught. They lament the loss of freedom, the impossibility of continuing their activities, the end of the power they once enjoyed. But the victims, the real people whose lives were destroyed, they are still just objects in their minds, things they used and broke, disposable tools that served a purpose and then lost their usefulness. Longitudinal studies conducted with violent sex offenders and sadistic murderers show that even after decades in prison, even after countless hours of mandatory therapy, the vast majority still regularly fantasize about the crimes they committed. Some, when granted anonymity in academic research, openly admit that they would do it all again, if given the opportunity and a guarantee of not being caught. The fundamental psychological structure does not change. They are not cured, they are not reformed, they do not experience genuine moral transformation. They merely adapt to the new environment, learn the rules of the prison system, simulate behaviors that reduce punishments and increase privileges. And this grim reality forces us to confront a final conclusion about everything we have discussed so far. And this grim reality forces us to confront a final conclusion about everything we've discussed so far. After descending into this deep psychological abyss, dissecting the minds of human predators, understanding the neurological and behavioral mechanisms that transform people into torturers, the inevitable question is, what do you really need to take away from this video for your life? What is the practical value of all this disturbing knowledge? First, and perhaps most importantly, extreme sadism is not an inexplicable mystery of the universe. It is not a supernatural force of evil. It is not something that simply happens without reason. It is a specific mental architecture meticulously built upon three pillars: need for power, obsession with absolute control, and a complete absence of functional empathy. Understanding this psychological structure removes the veil of mystery, strips away the artificial glamour of terror. When you understand the mechanisms, the monster ceases to be supernatural and becomes simply pathological. And pathological things can be identified, avoided, studied. Second, these criminals are not misunderstood geniuses operating at a superior intellectual level. This is a narrative that popular culture loves to perpetuate, but it's fundamentally false. They are calculating cowards who meticulously choose vulnerable victims, operating through manipulation and surprise, not brilliance. And here's your advantage. Knowledge is literally your best defense against this type of predator. Recognize the behavioral signs we discussed. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly why. Immediately leave situations that generate deep discomfort without feeling guilty or obligated to give detailed explanations. You owe no one anything when your safety is at stake. Third, never, under any circumstances, normalize cruelty disguised as a joke. Never ignore systematic disrespect because that's just how he is or she didn't mean it that way. Sadistic behavior, even in mild initial forms, progressively escalates when it finds environmental permission. When you accept the first cruel comment, you inadvertently signal that there's room for the second, then the third, then physical acts. Establish firm boundaries from the very first sign, not the 20th. Fourth, and this could literally save your life. If you are in a relationship where you feel constant fear, where you realize your partner visibly enjoys seeing you suffer, where what is called love is always accompanied by emotional or physical pain, understand right now that this is not intense passion, not a deep connection, not a complex relationship. It is real and immediate danger. Get out, plan, seek help, but get out. And finally, the reason why content like this exists. To deeply understand the minds of murderers and torturers is not to glorify them, not to give them the attention they crave, not to transform them into fascinating figures. It is exactly the opposite. It is to completely disarm the power they wield over our collective imagination. It is to transform mythological monsters into scientific case studies. It is to replace spectacle with clinical analysis. Because while these individuals desperately want to be remembered as terrifying legends, as figures that transcend ordinary humanity, we will treat them for what they truly are: broken psychological mechanisms that society needs to identify early, isolate when necessary, and study methodically to prevent future victims. Your brain now possesses analytical tools that 99% of the population lacks. You can read subtle behavioral cues. You can identify patterns of manipulation. You can recognize the difference between healthy assertiveness and a pathological need for control. Actively use this knowledge in your daily life. Protect not only yourself, but also those around you who may be vulnerable. And above all, never underestimate that instinctive discomfort your body feels when something is genuinely wrong. We evolved these self-preservation instincts for good reasons, and ignoring them in the name of politeness or courtesy can be very costly. But beyond all this education about danger and protection, there is one last layer to this discussion that needs to be addressed. But beyond all this, education about danger and protection, there's one last layer to this discussion that needs to be addressed. If you've made it this far, to this final moment of the video, you're not just someone with a passing curiosity about true crime. You're someone who understands that real knowledge about human behavior has practical value, that it can literally make the difference between safety and danger. And if this type of content, in-depth analysis, without sensationalism, focused on giving you real tools to understand and protect yourself, makes sense to you, then subscribe to the channel now. Because every week there's a new case being dissected in this same way, always with the goal of making you more prepared, more aware, more able to read the people around you. And leave a comment below saying, "I made it to the end. I read them all and I like to know who really absorbs this complete content." If this video changed anything in the way you see human behavior, leave a like, because that shows that this type of approach, educational, direct, without romanticizing criminals, is what really works. And look, there's a video right here that perfectly complements this topic, talking about how predators choose their victims and how the first 30 seconds of interaction determine everything. Click and continue watching, because the more you understand about the psychology behind these crimes, the better prepared you'll be to never become a statistic. Until the next analysis.